Greetings, friends. It's me, Wayman. Welcome once again to the Book of Judges for Dummies. And I got my beer, and we're going to have a drink and talk about it. And in the last two videos, I went into explaining chapters 1 and 2 and a little bit of historical background on the literature. So you say, Wayman, we got your opinion of it. What does Judaism have to say about it? Well, I have a text that I want to read. This is the Jewish Study Bible. Excellent text because it gives both the theological viewpoint and what the modern scholars are talking about. So I'm going to read parts of this, and so you can get an idea of what Judaism thinks about it. The Book of Judges is the second former prophets. Its place was determined chronologically. It covers the period after Joshua's death at the end of the book of Joshua and before the anointing of Saul as king in 1 Samuel. The book is named after its central characters, judges or chieftains, although the book ends before the birth of Samuel the prophet in 1 Samuel 8:1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel, suggests that Samuel and his sons should be considered judges as well. The judges were mostly known as tribal leaders who delivered their people from oppression. Some were military leaders, some were lone warriors, and one was both leader and commander. Some judges were some prophets. One was a Nazirite. Some were also priests who sat in judgment, while the acts of others weren't talked about. Judges does not describe the entire period of the judges, nor is it organized chronologically. And this is important. A lot of times the historical chronology is left for a theological point. It opens in the time of elders who served Joshua and concludes with Samson, so the last judges. Eli and Samuel now appear in the book of Samuel. The ending of the book of Judges, however, deals with events that took place at the start of the period, the conquest of Dan and the war against Gibeah, both of which are placed in the third generation after the Exodus from Egypt. This would be found 1830 and 2028. Its non-chronological order shows the editor's purpose was not only to describe and record the period, but to draw lessons from it. The book's main theme and its inefficiency of the judges, who could only save and affect their people for a limited time. Then the people would relapse, would be punished, would cry to the Lord to save them again. This recurrent theme of sin, punishment, and rescues gives the book its critical structure. So the book can be divided into three parts. The first is the exposition that describes the background to the rise of the judges. The second, the main part of the book, is devoted to largely the acts of the judges. And the third, the final part, describes two episodes. One of Micah's graven image and a shrine built at Dan, and the story of the rape in Gibeah and the subsequent civil war. These final episodes create the impression that monarchy alone could end the chaotic period of judges when there was no king in Israel. Every man did as he pleased. So in the first two videos, we already discussed that. So here it talks about the sages assume that the book of Judges was written by the prophet Samuel, who lived not longer after the events described. Biblical scholars, however, maintain that this book, like other historiographic books in the Bible, was written later and should not be viewed as a unified work of a single author. Scholars suggest that it could only have been written in an established social culture possessing self-consciousness, appropriate institutions, and receptive public. Scholars distinguish between Judges' stories, which are based on local tribal traditions, like we said, the early tribal league of deliverance, and which do not interpret the events theologically, causally, and their frameworks, which depict the deliverer in a broad national context, characterized by a cycle that begins with sin and ends with peace. There's widespread agreement that these frameworks reflect a Deuteronomistic rendition or redaction, which took the tribal stories, gave them national religious character, and fitted the whole into the great Deuteronomistic Deuteronomistic work that describes the history from the years of the wilderness, the book of Deuteronomy, to the Babylonian exile, the end of the book of Kings. At a later stage, they suggest post-Deuteronomistic redactors added certain passages, such as the ones about the Canaanite nations that were or were not driven out in the exposition and the concluding chapters. But the assumption that the book of Judges reflects the ideological world of Deuteronomy may not be correct. And this is important to remember too. Deuteronomy's ideology and style are only part evident in the book of Judges. And this is where we get the different writers, the Deuteronomistic literature, the southern ideas, the ideas from Israel were respected, so they were included. Judges is not like Joshua. The text of Judges is not like 1 Samuel. It's pro-monarch. So, but the assumption that the book of Judges reflects the ideological world of Deuteronomy may not be correct. Deuteronomy ideology and the style are only partly evident in the book of Judges. The Deuteronomistic literature criticizes monarchy, as we talked about in the speech of Samuel, where he lists all the terrible things a king would do when the people wanted one. Places prophets above it. Here we see in Samuel 2, where there's constant conflict between the prophet and the monarchy, and demands centralization of the cult. So the Deuteronomistic priestly caste demanded centralization. Here, this text could be wrong, because showing the chaotic period and non-centralization in the book of Judges would show that the writer of Judges, in showing how chaotic it was actually for centralization of the call of Yahweh, and depicts the deity as a remote being whose name alone dwells in the temple. By contrast, the book of Judges has positive expectations from the monarchy. That's correct. Makes scarcely any reference to prophecy, and its functions of predicting historical events. Does not call for centralization of the cult. It does, in fact, I believe, and shows God intervening in the events directly or by means of angels. Moreover, the phrases that are typical of Deuteronomistic literature are concentrated only in the exposition of the book, chapter 2:6 to 3:4. It would seem, therefore, that the main redaction, turn the page, or in those storybooks like the kids, Book of Judges was completed pre-Deuteronomistic stage, namely in the 8th or 7th century BCE, and that it reflected the shocked mood of Judah after the downfall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. See the allusion to the exile in Judges 18:30. This would explain the negative portrayal of northern tribes throughout the book, from the exposition which accuses them of the sin of failing to drive out all the local inhabitants, to the final chapters that speak of Mount Ephraim and the shrine at Dan as sinful places. By contrast, the tribe of Judah is depicted in the opening as a tribe which succeeded completely in driving out local inhabitants and was faithful to the covenant of God. The redaction sought to justify the punishment that befell the northern kingdom by showing it as a group of sinful tribes. This theme is evident in each of the sections of the book. The book later was slightly adapted when it became part of the great Deuteronomistic work of Deuteronomy to Kings. Additions from this period or later may include the Deuteronomistic phrases noticeable in expositions Judges 2:11-19, the text criticizing Gideon for making the ephod, that'd be Judges 8:27b, and the episode of the concubine in Gibeah, chapters 19-21 in Judges, which is mainly a veiled polemical attack on the house of Saul. So we talked about that in one of my other videos I did. So this is quite interesting, and that's a little bit of background on how Judaism looks at it and some of the theological viewpoints of it. So hopefully you'll enjoy the series. Take care, friends. And remember, if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking.